There are many men of great power in our system. There are businessmen and politicians, generals and bureaucrats. Yet in the system that runs the modern Western world, there is perhaps no more powerful class than the banker. In the United States they may be managers, and sometimes celebrities. Some may be viewed as heroes and others villains. Yet in Europe, their history runs much deeper. At the top of our global order sits the old banking families of Europe. For in this system, money, credit, and assets are at the center of it all. And the banker, he creates the credit, he owns the assets, and he controls the money. Many of these powerful families have long histories, some stretching back far before the United States began. And while those who sit atop the financial machine upon which the order runs has changed over these lifetimes, some have kept their seats for centuries. So who are these men who run the financial machinery, the apparatus at the heart of our modern system? Who are these families who have held vast wealth and power all these lifetimes? And who were the men who started it all? While I will not be able to tell the story of all of these families, this is the story of some of them, the story of Europe's old banking families, the families for whom the empires run. Berenbergs is one of the world's oldest banks. Founded in 1590, its founding family can trace its origins back far into the early modern period of Europe. While Berenbergs now offers investment banking, wealth management, asset management, and corporate banking services, it can trace its roots to 16th century cloth merchants. Early members of the Berenbergs family rose to prominence as cloth merchants in Antwerp, in the Spanish Netherlands. Yet, during the Reformation, they became part of a small group of wealthy Dutch Lutherans, and as a result, during the Dutch Revolt of the 80 Years' War, were forced out of the Spanish Netherlands under Catholic Habsburg control. They made their way to Hamburg, which had become an extraordinarily wealthy free city in the Holy Roman Empire, tracing its commercial origins back to the Hanseatic League, a medieval network of merchant guilds, cities, and ports across northern Europe. There the family continued their cloth business, amassing great wealth. In 1590, Berenbergs brothers Hans and Paul would start a merchant house in Hamburg, finding great success in growing the family's prominence. They became particularly prominent importers and exporters, facilitating the cloth trade. And all while their family rose, they intermarried with many of the most prominent families of Hamburg, many of whom were prominent Dutch families who had been displaced during the 80 Years' War and the Reformation. Hans's grandson, Cornelius Berenbergs, had a prominent merchant father and a mother who was the daughter of a Holy Roman Empire noble. He would take the family's merchant empire and turn it into a banking endeavor. And from his merchant bank, he would facilitate trade with France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Russia. The enterprise would grow quite rapidly, particularly owing to the vast network of Dutch families who would come to settle all across Europe. By this point, although the Berenbergs family had become quite integrated in Hamburg, they still felt Dutch allegiances. Yet Cornelius would take an oath as a Hamburg burgher, officially joining Hamburg's ruling class of the Grand Burghers. Firmly entrenched in the ruling class of one of the wealthiest free cities of all Europe, the family's bank would continue to grow to become one of the world's most powerful financial institutions, while the family's members would frequently serve as senators in Hamburg. They would continue to intermarry with some of the continent's most wealthy and powerful families, all while developing many modern banking practices and becoming extraordinarily wealthy. The family would remain dominant for nearly 200 years, until in 1768, Paul Berenbergs would die childless. After his death, his brother Johann Berenbergs would take on his son-in-law as partner at the bank. This son-in-law, Johann Hinrich Goslar, would become his heir and take over the family's enterprise. The Goslar family were themselves a very powerful Hamburg burgher family. Johann's daughter was married to Ludwig Edwin Sailer, who would become head of the bank, where in 1791 the bank would be renamed to Johann Berenberg, Goslar and Company. By this point, the bank had become absolutely enormous, and the family had become integrated with many of the most powerful families all across Europe, particularly in Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. Many of the family's descendants would reliably be senators in Hamburg, with Berenberg descendant Hermann Goslar becoming the first mayor and president of the Senate of the Free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg in 1874. Within the Holy Roman Empire, the free cities had enormous political power. These were not simply cities. They were akin to being their own principalities, though generally they were run as republics. And with Hamburg being such a wealthy and powerful trade city in the empire, this made the role of first mayor on par with the power held by some of the most powerful princes in the empire. The Hamburg Senate would grant Johann Berenberg Goslar and his descendants the name Berenberg Goslar, which is the name that the family would hold henceforth. And in 1888, they would be ennobled in Prussia and raised to the rank of barons in 1910. And this may seem as though it was a grand honor. Yet at this point, being a Grand Burgher in Hamburg was a vastly more powerful and prestigious position than being a baron. In fact, during this period, many of the powerful banking and merchant families were attempting to displace the nobles of old Europe. The traditional nobility of Europe posed a threat to the power and wealth that these banking families were amassing. All across Europe, they were displacing, bankrupting, subverting, and destroying the traditional nobilities. There was a strong liberal and republican ethos amongst these banking families, and though they were often presented as high and lofty values, practically, they wished to become the ruling class. They wanted to take over the power that had previously been held by the nobles. And so when the Berenberg Goslars were given the title of baron, many in the family objected to it, feeling as though this had besmirched their name, as the banking aristocracy was rising while the nobility was falling. During this period, Berenberg Bank became an enormous financier of the Industrial Revolution, being one of the main creditors of the German Industrial Revolution. Yet quite notably, they would also become major players in the rising United States. They would open branches in Boston and New York, becoming a major financier and facilitator of the commodities trade in North America, as well as founding and funding many of Germany's largest shipping companies, creating an economic link between the United States and Germany. They would forge very close ties with prominent banking families all across Europe, including a very close link with the Baring family and Barings Bank in England. And their ascension would continue into the 20th century. However, following the First World War, German nobles were stripped of their titles and rights. Yet title and nobility was of little importance to the Berenberg Goslars. Their class had already thoroughly defeated the old nobility of Europe, and they retained their banking empire and vast fortune. By this point, they were the aristocracy, and title meant nothing. However, beginning in the late 1920s, and particularly during the 1930s and 40s during the rise of the Nazi Party, they would find themselves in opposition to the new government. By this point, the family had forged very close ties with some of the most powerful Jewish banking families of Germany. And so, as the new regime rose, they would seek to protect those business partners, friends, and family. Yet throughout the war, and following its conclusion, they would retain vast wealth. Their family had come to include politicians, bankers, ambassadors, and diplomats, as well as lawyers, and the rising new class of non-government organization heads. Their intermarriage was so significant that they had become related to many of Europe's most powerful families, including the Barings, the Warburgs, the Omsnicks, and even the House of Orange-Nassau itself, with King Willem Alexander of the Netherlands being a Berenberg Goslar descendant. Today, although they don't retain direct partnership control over Berenberg, they remain major owners of the bank and sit on its advisory board. Today, many of these old families prefer not to be particularly public-facing, and very often they operate with a degree of removal from their companies, yet they remain major bankers, diplomats, politicians, lawyers, as well as the heads of NGOs, which is one of the most significant avenues to exerting influence that these families utilize today. The family's law firm, Berenberg Goslar, would merge into Taylor Wessing, and Heinrich von Berenberg Goslar would start the Berlin-based Berenberg Verlag publishing company. Something that's quite notable about the Berenberg Gosslers is that while many of these powerful families have ended via patrilineal descent and continue via matrilineal, they have retained their name much longer than many of their peers, and with Berenberg Bank continuing to operate as a major investment bank, all while the family holds many influential positions all across Europe. The family certainly deserves recognition as being one of the most incredible success stories of these banking families. At one point, Barings was a very real contender for the most powerful institution on the planet. The earliest known ancestor of the Baring family was Peter Baring, a 15th century burgher in Groningen. Though not a great deal is known, it is known that his son, Franz Baring, would become the first Lutheran bishop of Wallenbergs around the start of the 16th century. From there, the family would be very involved in religious scholarship, with descendant Franz Baring, born in 1657, being a professor of theology in Bremen. He would marry the daughter of a prominent wool merchant, and together they would have a son, although unfortunately he would die before the birth of his child. That son, born in 1697, would be Johann Baring. Being raised by his mother's family, he would be sent to Exeter in England to learn the wool trade. After his apprenticeship, he would decide to remain in England, becoming a full subject in 1723. He would marry Elizabeth Fowler, the daughter of a prominent grocer, who came with a large dowry of around £20,000. Together they would have 4 sons and 1 daughter, all of whom would go on to greatly expand the family's prominence. The couple's oldest son, John, would inherit the family's cloth business, and he would bring on his younger brother, Francis, as a partner. There would be 2 main branches of their business, one in London and one in Exeter. They would primarily focus on the cloth trade, but begin expanding into financial services as well. Yet over time, John would pull back from the London business, focusing almost entirely on the larger venture in Exeter. There John would expand the business and become an MP for Exeter in 1776, leaving the London business to his younger brother Francis. And from there, the institution of Barings would be born. Francis Baring would begin to expand the London business, beginning with accounts received from an old family friend, Nathaniel Pierce, who was retiring. Initially, the London business would act as agent for the Exeter business, yet over time, it would begin to expand overseas as well. Despite many financial problems and bad investments made by Francis, prominent London merchants and financiers would see great promise in him, and he would be appointed to the court of the Royal Exchange Assurance Company, an extremely prominent insurance business at the time. Yet he remained constrained by his older brother and the Exeter business, and in 1777, he would break, dissolving the partnership. Over the following decades, the firm would expand enormously. By this point, the dominant financial hub, Amsterdam, was receding, and the center of finance in Europe was moving to London. This put Francis Baring at the perfect place in the perfect time. He would facilitate trade with Europe, the West Indies, and North America, acting as agent for overseas merchants, making advances, and becoming a large player in the growing bills of exchange market. By 1804, partnership capital had reached £400,000, and he had become one of London's wealthiest bankers. He would make large investments in the West Indies, particularly in the sugar and slave trades, while on the continent he would forge close ties with Amsterdam, particularly the dominant firm Hope & Co. As his prominence grew, he would become a significant advisor to cabinet ministers. His brother John would become MP for Exeter, while his sister was married to the MP for Calne. These connections would bring him close to the Earl Shelburne, William Petty, who would become Prime Minister. This would afford him enormous political influence, where for much of his life, he would become perhaps the most prominent financial and economic advisor to the British government. He would become an MP himself in 1784, as well as a director of the East India Company. Within politics, he focused on his main issue, being a proponent of free trade. He would become a major financier of businesses all across the world, as well as a financier during the American War of Independence, ultimately becoming the main English financier of the United States. Ultimately, over the course of his life, he would become one of the most powerful bankers in the world, and would be created Sir Francis Baring, the first Baron Baring. He and his wife, Harriet Herring, would have many children, and they would become enormously integrated into Britain's ruling class. The family would intermarry with MPs, bankers, and noblemen, with many family members starting other financial firms that would go on to become enormous in their own right, including Francis's son George, who would start a trading house that would become Dent & Co. Throughout the 19th century, the Barings would become one of Britain's most significant families, and rise to become perhaps the most powerful bankers in all the world, becoming colloquially referred to as the Sixth Great Power, behind only the empires of Europe themselves. In 1803, Barings would finance the Louisiana Purchase. Following the Napoleonic Wars in 1817, they would finance French bond issues for reparation payments. In 1839, Sir Francis Thornhill Baring would become Chancellor of the Exchequer, and throughout the middle and later decades of the century, many new peerages would be created for the family. In total, there would be 5 noble Baring houses. The Barons Ashburton, the Barons Northbrook, later created the Earls of Northbrook, the Barons Revelstoke, the Earls Cromer, and the Barons Howick of Glendale. Yet beyond this, they would intermarry with so many of Europe and America's most powerful families, including the Berenbergs Goslers, the prominent American Bingham family, as well as the Lorellards. They would intermarry with the Marquis of Lansdowne, the Earls Grey, the Baron Stanley of Alderley, the Montague family, of the Dukes Manchester and the Earls Sandwich, the Wyndham family, and the German von Baring family, who had been ennobled in Germany. The family would hold many powerful financial positions, yet additionally, many powerful government offices as well, including Evelyn Baring, the first Earl Cromer, who would be appointed Consul General of Egypt, making him Egypt's de facto ruler. One very major investment they made was Argentina. Barings would facilitate the first bond issuance of Buenos Aires, and be the firm responsible for opening up Latin America for investment. This would make Barings a great fortune. However, in 1890, the Argentine government would collapse, and with enormous exposure, Barings would be at risk of bankruptcy. Yet due to the sheer scale and significance of Barings, the Bank of England would organize a bailout. The bailout would be formed by a consortium of many of London's most powerful banks, one of whom was Rothschild, which at the time was a very powerful and rising competitor, looking to perhaps be on the verge of overtaking them as London's most powerful bank. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Barings would participate heavily in the Dollar Princess phenomenon, intermarrying heavily with American heiresses, both bringing enormous wealth into the family, yet also forging powerful ties to the United States. Throughout the 20th century, they would continue in both politics and finance, including being later holders of colonial offices prior to the dissolution of the direct territorial empire. Barings would remain a large and powerful bank throughout most of the 20th century. However, it would recede and lose the sheer dominance that it once held, being overtaken by newer banks. The family, however, was so thoroughly integrated in the ruling classes of America, Britain, and Europe that their familial network no longer relied on the bank. They were involved with many other financial firms, as well as the British state, and they retained their influence. By the 1990s, Barings was Britain's oldest merchant bank. Yet in 1992, futures trading conducted out of their Singapore branch would result in the beginning of the end for Barings Bank. In 1992, Nick Leeson, head of operations and chief trader for Baring Futures Singapore, would open a secret internal account, attempting to use this account to correct trading mistakes and hide losses that had been accrued from unauthorized trading. Over the following years, this trading activity would accumulate enormous losses, all while he would attempt to keep them hidden. By the end of 1994, the hidden losses that had been racked up would reach £208 million. In January of 1995, a desperate Leeson would begin making enormous, risky bets, entering into enormous levered bets on the Nikkei. He was betting that the Nikkei would be stable or rise. Yet on January 17th, a devastating earthquake would hit Japan, causing the Nikkei to plunge precipitously. The bet had moved sharply against Leeson, and he would double down, trading harder, attempting to recoup those losses. In February, the bank would begin facing enormous margin calls. They just could not keep this hidden any longer. Barings would be forced to put up hundreds of millions of pounds in collateral. The main office in London, believing that the Singapore business was profitable, would wire the money to Leeson, completely unaware of all of these enormous losses and these speculative bets. However, by the end of the month, a Barings settlement clerk would discover discrepancies from the Singapore office. Leeson would flee Singapore, leaving only a note behind saying, "I'm sorry." Very shortly thereafter, Barings would discover what had happened and realize the true scale of their losses. Unable to meet their margin calls, Barings would face accumulated losses of £827 million, which was more than double the entirety of the bank's available trading capital. The Bank of England would not be able to save them, and the bank would be declared insolvent, being placed into administration. On March 6th of 1995, the Dutch ING would acquire Barings, assuming all of their liabilities and paying £1 for the company. In 2001, ING would sell Barings' US operations to ABN AMRO and fold the rest into its European banking division. By this point, only Barings Asset Management remained. Yet in 2005, Mass Mutual would acquire their investment management division and take the name, while Northern Trust would acquire their financial services group. In 2016, Mass Mutual would merge Barings Asset Management with other asset management subsidiaries of their company, creating a new entity, Barings, while Barings Private Equity International would be bought out by various management groups around the world, creating a number of different private equity firms all around the world today. And while the bank has lost what it once was, the family still remains enormously prominent and powerful in the United Kingdom and across the world. They still hold most of their historic titles and have extraordinary wealth. The current head of the family is Francis Baring, the 6th Baron Northbrook. He is a Tory politician and one of the remaining hereditary peers in the House of Lords. He has had an enormously successful financial career, including starting his own asset management company, and is a founding trustee of the Fortune Forum charity, a charity which places its focus in global poverty, global health, and climate. It's very much in the vein of globalist foundations, with a heavily internationalist outlook. And largely while this family has become less known by the public, they're right at the top of doing what British banking aristocracy families do: finance, politics, influence, and foundations. Particularly with such a rapid rise and a catastrophic collapse of the bank, the story of the Barings institution is quite fascinating, while the family is a testament to multi-generational wealth and the raw power of the City of London. Of all of these families, none have captured the public's interest in the way that Rothschild has. Their story begins with Mayer Amschel Rothschild, born in 1743, a prominent banker and gold trader in the Holy Roman Empire. He began his career at Simon Wolf Oppenheimer's bank, becoming extremely skilled at currency trading. As he ascended as a financier, he would become particularly renowned as a dealer of rare coins, and through this business, he would come to know some of the most powerful men within the empire, ultimately becoming the personal banker for Wilhelm IX, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. While working for the Landgrave, the French Revolution would break out, and Mayer would spot an opportunity. The British government feared that there would be a contagion effect, and that the French Revolution would spread to more of Europe, or to Britain, and thus they began funding Hessian mercenaries, attempting to gain some control over the chaos, and the mercenaries' pay would run through him. This allowed him to expand his banking business significantly. Later on, during the Napoleonic Wars, he would once again spot opportunity in chaos. Hesse-Kassel would be blockaded, and the Landgrave would flee. By this point, Mayer had become the Landgrave's principal banker, and he would be tasked with handling all of the Landgrave's cross-border transactions. Though he had achieved enormous success, the true story of the family's rise would begin with his sons. He sought for his 5 sons to continue his banking business, and to expand it across Europe. He would send Amschel Mayer to Frankfurt, Nathan to London, Kallmann to Naples, Jacob to Paris, and Solomon to Vienna. And though many of them would achieve great success, there would be 2 in particular whose rise would be truly stratospheric. In 1798, at 21 years old, his son, Nathan Meyer, would move to Manchester, England. There he would begin financing the highly active textiles trade, and after some time growing his business there, he would move to London. At this point, London was truly cementing itself as the center of finance, not only for Europe, but the world. Once he had arrived in London, he began trading debt. He would become highly active as a trader in bills of exchange, building himself an enormous fortune through his bank, N.M. Rothschild and Sons. He would expand the business to forex, bond trading, and brokerage, making himself one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in all Britain. As he rose to become one of the most important figures in all of the British debt market, he would become vital to the British state. With the advent of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was in need of financing on a vast scale, and Nathan would step in to become the state's financier. Something which allowed him to achieve so much success was the very close familial network with his brothers. When he would be retained to send payments to British troops for the Napoleonic Wars, he would work through his brother, James Mayer de Rothschild. James had moved to Paris in 1812 to coordinate on the gold trade with Nathan, and had opened de Rothschild Frères, himself becoming one of the most powerful bankers in France. As time would go on, the French de Rothschilds would be one of the most powerful banking families in France, and extremely influential advisors to many of the French government, as well as the owners of the prestigious Chateau Lafite. This network, established by the brothers, allowed them to operate internationally on a level that was very difficult to do at the time, and thus routed quite a lot of business through them. In Britain, Nathan had achieved such a level of extraordinary wealth and power that he had become a legendary figure during his own lifetime. All sorts of rumors and stories would begin about him, speculating just how much power he had over British finance, and just how much he could truly control markets. Nathan would marry Hannah Barendt Cohen, the daughter of one of London's most powerful financiers, the Dutch-born Levi Barendt Cohen. The couple would have 7 children, many of whom would be brought into the family's banking business, with some as well getting into politics, becoming MPs. His son Lionel would become the first practicing Jewish MP. He and his family had been ennobled in Austria, and was permitted to use his title in Britain. Prime Minister Gladstone would seek for him to be given noble title in Britain, yet Queen Victoria would refuse, believing that ennobling a Jew would cause social discontent. Even his presence as an MP had caused discontent, due to his refusal to swear oath on a Christian Bible. In Parliament, his constituency was the City of London, and he was a part of the growing political force of the London Jews, many of whom were beginning to amass great wealth. By this point, the family's bank was a major financier of the British Empire. As the empire expanded, and particularly as more territorial control was taken by the Crown, Britain came to require very large infrastructure projects, and N.M. Rothschild would step in to finance them. Lionel's son, Nathan Meyer, would become partner at N.M. Rothschild, and he would become perhaps the greatest financier of empire. Nathaniel would finance enormous projects in the United States, Russia, and Austria, yet his main business would be the British Empire. He financed enormous projects, forming a close relationship with Cecil Rhodes, funding the British South Africa Company and the De Beers Company. He would even be the financier for the Suez Canal. The sheer scale of what N.M. Rothschild had become at this point was gargantuan, and was becoming the world's most powerful financial institution. If an empire has vital infrastructure that it depends on, and there is one banker who finances much of it, well then that financier has vast imperial power. But more than that, Rothschild would make use of convertible debt, and thus in some cases were capable of becoming the owners of the imperial infrastructure directly. During Nathaniel's life, the British Empire had become completely dependent on Rothschild, and the family members were prominent advisors, politicians, and in many cases were setting imperial policy directly. During the First World War, Rothschild and American banks would become the primary financiers of British war debt, while Nathan would become the primary advisor to the British cabinet, advising for a very high tax and spend policy, advising, quote, tax the rich and tax them heavily. He would be ennobled in the United Kingdom, being created the first Baron Rothschild. As Nathaniel was becoming an older man, he would hand much of his business to his son, Walter. Walter himself would become a very powerful political figure and financier, yet he is perhaps best known for his role in the Zionist movement. He would work quite closely with his friend, Chaim Weizmann, the leading Zionist figure in Britain. Together, the two would become the most influential advocates for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, with the famous Balfour Declaration, written by Arthur Balfour, addressed to Walter personally. Walter would die with no heir in 1937, and thus his title would pass to his nephew, the son of his brother, Nathaniel Charles Rothschild. That son, Victor Rothschild, would become the third Baron Rothschild. And Victor is a truly wild character. He would initially show a great interest in zoology, earning a doctorate and working in the zoology department of Trinity College. Where his story really begins to get interesting is that despite claiming that he was never a Marxist, he would join a Marxist secret society, the Cambridge Apostles. And though one might think, hey, he just got wrapped up in something, he would then go on to become very close friends with members of the Cambridge Spy Ring, a group of Cambridge students recruited by the NKVD, who for a nearly 20-year span would pass intelligence to the Soviet Union. Well, maybe he was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. They lived in the same apartment. During the Second World War, he would work for MI5. Later in his life, he would become head of the Central Policy Review Staff, a government body formed to create and coordinate policy across the government. There would be much denial that he ever had any interaction with the Soviet Union or was involved with any sort of espionage. But wow, is that hard to believe. I just joined a Marxist secret society and all my best friends were Soviet spies. I had no idea about this. Following his death, his son Jacob would become the fourth Baron Rothschild, and he would be much more of a traditional financier and a lot less spy-y. Or he was just a lot better at it, so we don't know. He would work through many financial firms, including Rothschild Investment Trust, and he would as well be on the advisory board of the very powerful private equity firm, Blackstone. His investment activities were wide-sweeping, particularly in the media and energy businesses. Similar to many of his peers, he was particularly active in foundations and the growing space of non-government organizations. He would be a major funder of many interests and serve on many boards, including particularly heavy involvement in Israel. His family's Israeli foundation had paid for Israel's Knesset and Supreme Court buildings. By this point, they had their hands in so many things that it's really hard to pin down exactly what he did, per se. He did a bit of everything. Really, he had money, and that's what he did. He had money, and people did what he said. Following his death, the title would be inherited by his son Nathaniel, who is the current holder of the title. He would work at RIT Capital and Lazard, and has since gone on to have many investment interests, particularly a very large presence in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. So, the Rothschild family is a very good example of one of these families that has retained pretty much all of their influence and wealth, and with so many family members across the world, all still working together. They may be the most efficient of these banking families. Today you'll find them in government, finance, foundations, law, media, and non-government organizations. And with many family members with their hands in many things, they are easily one of the most ubiquitous of these banking families. The Wallenbergs are a quite new entrant to the list, and despite being quite young for one of these banking families, their meteoric rise really makes them quite worthy of note. The earliest identifiable ancestor of the Wallenbergs is Per Hansen, born in 1670 in Sweden. He would be the progenitor of the family's name, and all children born after him would be named Wallenberg. His great-great-grandson, born in 1816, would be Andre Oskar Wallenberg. He would become a sailor and commission as a Navy officer in 1835, becoming a Swedish Navy lieutenant in 1837. He would remain in both the Swedish and later Danish navies until 1850, where he would leave and become head of a boatswain's company in Sundsvall, Sweden. From here, he would dedicate his life to business, moving to Stockholm 5 years later. Here, he would become a banker, forming Stockholm's Enskilda Bank in 1856. The bank was enormously successful, particularly in industrial lending, which was exploding at the time. The bank would also make enormous profits financing government bond issues. Under Andre, the bank would become one of Sweden's leading institutions in lending for major industrial and infrastructure projects. Born in 1853, his son Knut would take over as CEO, and on the board of Enskilda Bank, Knut would assert himself as a very prominent figure in Sweden, becoming a member of the Riksdag in 1907, and Sweden's Minister for Foreign Affairs in 1914. He had become Sweden's top banker and a highly influential politician. However, Sweden's legislature would pass a law, making it highly difficult for banks to invest in industrial companies, and this looked like it could pose a threat to the Wallenberg business, as they were not only debt financiers of Sweden's industrial boom, but equity investors and the originators of many industrial projects. So, in 1916, Knut would form Investor, a separate investment company, which would be held by the family to serve as their investment arm. Wallenberg shares in the bank would be transferred to Investor, and from here on out, Investor would be the entity through which the Wallenbergs made investments. The family continued to grow and experience enormous success, yet they would experience some major changes during the Second World War. Though it isn't entirely certain what the Wallenbergs and their bank did during the war, it looks as though they made a business hiding German assets, particularly taking German companies and placing them temporarily under their ownership, thus shielding them from seizure by the Allies, with two notable examples being Bosch and IG Farben. They would also transact in stolen German gold, making investments in assets that some claimed the Germans had stolen, particularly in Eastern Europe and from Jews. They would as well finance German wartime research, including research into atomic science. Precisely the full extent of their wartime dealings is still not entirely known, yet it is quite clear that they did have extensive dealings with the Germans, and this caused them to have great trouble with their business in the United States, as Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau would blockade their business, cleaving them off from United States finance. Simultaneously, however, a cousin of the direct banking line, Raoul Wallenberg, would spend this time attempting to get Hungarian Jews out of German-occupied territory. He would also issue fake passports, designed to obscure the identities of Hungarian Jews, or aid in their exodus. His story as well remains a bit of a mystery, and we don't know entirely what happened, as he was ultimately captured by Soviets, and would disappear. Following the Second World War, the bank, the family, and Investor would all continue to grow, becoming far and away the wealthiest people in Sweden, as well as highly active politicians, diplomats, and the heads of foundations. In Sweden, the only real competition for most influential family would be between the Wallenbergs and the Bernadottes, from whom the monarchy comes. It's either the Wallenbergs or the kings, and at least in raw financial power, the Wallenbergs win. In 1971, under the leadership of Marcus Wallenberg, Stockholm's Enskilda Bank would merge with their prime rival, Skandinaviska Banken, another extremely powerful bank in Sweden. The new combined entity, Skandinaviska Enskilda Banken, or SEB, would become an absolute behemoth in Sweden, and as of today, the largest shareholder of the bank is Investor, with a little over 21% ownership. The family's dominance continues today, with Investor serving as their investment arm, Foundations Asset Management serving as the financial management arm for their foundations, and with SEB as their bank, where Wallenbergs continue to sit as chairman of the board. Today, Investor is Sweden's largest public company, with a market cap of around $98 billion, and it is certainly Sweden's largest investment company. They hold a large stake in EQT, which serves as the family's private equity investment arm, with around $315 billion under management. Investor holds very large stakes in some major companies, including AstraZeneca, Electrolux, Nasdaq Inc., and Saab. Investor is also the majority shareholder of the investment company Patricia Industries. Today, Jacob Wallenberg is chairman of Investor, with these very powerful financial companies remaining tightly in the family's control. Something quite interesting about the Wallenbergs is that while they are very subdued and are not conspicuous with their wealth, they are also quite public, certainly to an extent that is very uncommon with these families. Though they're not flashy and ostentatious, they are also not secretive in the way that many others are. For example, if one were to speak with a British establishment source about the power of the Rothschild family, pointing out that, hey, these guys sure owned a whole lot of the empire, and wow, they financed a lot of wars, they sure seem to own a lot of the media, and it seems to me like they set a lot of government policy, the response that one would get would be something like, what? No, that's crazy. That's just some sort of wild conspiracy. I don't know where people get these ideas. But in Sweden, if you pointed out the power and influence of the Wallenbergs, clearly the most powerful people in all of Sweden, you would simply get, yeah, the economy, oh that's theirs, they own all the stuff, and they aren't trying to hide it. And to an extent, that gives them a degree of goodwill that many of these families are not given in other countries. And though this is just conjecture, I suspect that it's because of both not trying to be too flashy and flaunt their wealth, but also not trying to hide their influence and lie about it either. Today, the family continues to do much of what they've always done, and the family continues with both extraordinary wealth and extraordinary influence, and particularly with only really arising in the late 19th century, the Wallenbergs are a really impressive story of such a rapid rise and just how much of one country's economy a family can hold. So far, we have talked about some very wealthy and prominent families, some very famous with enormous global institutions. Without even knowing much about them, most people have heard the name Rothschild. Yet there is another class of banker, the one who is not on TV and who doesn't have a personal Wikipedia page. Particularly in countries like Switzerland, a class of very wealthy banker emerged, who often served as banker to the bankers. These families of private bankers do not show their wealth and choose to keep their very powerful relationships quiet and subtle. One of these such families is the Pictet family. There are a number of mighty Swiss private banking families, and though it's difficult to nail down who should be number one on that list, Pictet is certainly one of the top contenders. The origin of the Pictet family goes back to pre-Reformation Geneva, a separate independent city-state. The family had been part of Geneva's ruling class for a long time, reliably being at the top of Geneva's government, including later being on Geneva's Little Council during the Calvinist period. Born in 1755, Charles Pictet de Rochemont would represent Geneva in the 1815 Congress of Vienna, securing the neutrality and position of Geneva within the Swiss Confederation. By this point, Switzerland was one of Europe's most dominant banking hubs, particularly owing to its geographic location, neutrality, and political structure. Swiss bankers were becoming some of the most important men in Europe, and they were almost always very subtle. In 1805, the merchant bank Decandolle Malais would be formed. It would have business in forex, trade finance, and investing for very wealthy clients. This class of private wealth bankers was rising to become very wealthy, very influential, and very socially significant. In 1841, Pictet descendant Edouard Pictet Prévost, the nephew of Decandolle's wife, would join the bank as a named partner. Within Swiss private banking, these very prestigious banks were structured as partnerships. Typically, the partners would be the members of very wealthy families within the Swiss Confederation, generally investing their own and others' wealth, and they would also be entirely liable for any losses from the bank. At this point, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to sweep across Europe and North America, and the bank would become a significant financier to industry. They would finance major infrastructure projects, including the first railroads in Switzerland. Generations of Pictets would be partners in the firm, as well as significant political figures in Switzerland and across Europe. In 1907, partner Ernest Pictet would successfully lobby for a Swiss central bank, becoming one of the main and most powerful driving forces for the Swiss National Bank. In 1926, the firm would adopt the name Pictet and Company. By this point, it had ceased many of its banking functions and was almost entirely focused on the investment of wealth of the partners, as well as investing the wealth of some of the other most powerful families of Europe, with some additional private banking services, and all with incredible subtlety and secrecy. The culture of these Swiss private banking families is quite notable. They are among the most subtle of wealthy families, being at the extreme end of not ever flaunting wealth. They're like the Scandinavian or New England upper classes, but even more subtle. They generally have an ethos of not showing any displays of wealth at all publicly. No flashy cars, no lavish clothes. You wear the same thing until it just falls apart. And this has generally been a strategy that has been highly successful for multi-generational wealth. And particularly if you are being tasked with overseeing the assets of other very wealthy and powerful families, you don't want to be seen as ostentatious and flaunting your wealth. You want to be subtle, respectful, and responsible. Following the Second World War, Pictet would expand internationally, opening asset management businesses in Montreal, London, and Tokyo. And today, they exist as a global investment firm. Their ownership structure would change somewhat in 2014, when they would move from their old unlimited liability partnership structure to a corporate partnership structure limited by shares. However, the partners remain the sole owners and managers, with the 9th generation of Pictets still running the firm today. Pictet is not alone in this class of Swiss private banks. Another bank that could have just as easily been on this list is Lombard Odier, another very old Swiss private bank. And these families are highly integrated with each other. In fact, there have been many partnerships like this over the prior centuries, as these Swiss banking families have formed various ventures together. Some other families of this nature would be the Lombard family, the Odier family, the Derrier family, and the Hensch family. This is one of the most interesting class of banking families, as they're generally the least well known, yet are extraordinarily integrated into the global financial system, managing wealth for some of the world's most powerful figures, and doing banking with great secrecy. These families may be perhaps the most prime example of the saying, "Real bankers don't have Wikipedia pages." The last family that I'm going to tell the story of is so remarkable because their bank is so old. Founded in 1672, Hoares & Company is the oldest private bank in the United Kingdom, and today it continues highly successfully, particularly renowned for its discretion, high level of service, and its prestige. The story begins with Richard Hoare, born in 1648, the son of horse dealer Henry Hoare. He had gone to apprentice with the goldsmiths, a very powerful force in England at the time. In these days, the goldsmiths were becoming the progenitors of modern banking. They did this by lending out gold, holding gold for clients, and making loans. Yet they were also developing a modern system of money. If you were to go to the goldsmiths seeking a loan, instead of giving you gold, they may give you a gold receipt. And because everyone knew that the goldsmiths would honor their receipts, that gold receipt was as good as gold. But if we look closer, what actually happened? What happened when the goldsmiths gave out that receipt as a loan? Well, the customer went to the goldsmiths, depositing no gold and simply asking for a loan. The goldsmiths neither received nor paid out any gold. They issued a gold receipt. In effect, they created new gold that didn't exist, at least in the eyes of England's economy. Entirely new gold had been added in, thus giving the goldsmiths the power to create money. Goldsmith apprentice Richard Hoare would complete his apprenticeship in 1672, being granted the freedom of the Worshipful Company of the Goldsmiths, a very old guild and fraternal order. He created his own business in London, forming Hoare and Company, and immediately his business was extremely successful, with prominent early clients such as Samuel Pepys and Catherine of Braganza. He became one of the most notable men of London, being knighted by Queen Anne in 1702 and becoming Lord Mayor of the City of London in 1712. In 1690, Hoare and Company moved its location to Fleet Street, where it still exists today. It's at this time that he began focusing on the banking business, becoming one of the most key players in England's economy. Hoare and Company achieved enormous success, and this is in large part owed to the excellent management of its partners, all of whom members of the family. In the early 18th century, it would successfully navigate the South Sea bubble, an enormous speculative bubble that wiped out a great many investors. Hoare and Company, however, bought in and sold at just the right time, making a sizable profit of around £28,000. Richard's son, Henry, born in 1677, would become an enormously successful banker, becoming the commissioner for the building of 50 new churches in London and acquiring the Stourhead estate in Wiltshire in 1717. He would have the estate's new grand structure built, but would die before its completion. During this century, the bank would be on top of London. He would be at the forefront of innovation, being one of the first banks to use printed checks, issuing their first in 1763, and making the family incredibly wealthy and putting them at the top of the new rising banking elite, a class who had been creeping up and was beginning to overtake the traditional landed nobility. In 1844, the Bank Charter Act would restrict the powers of banks and give the Bank of England a monopoly on the creation of notes. This caused thousands of English banks to fail. Some were bought out and some simply collapsed. Yet through the successful navigation of Charles Hoare, the bank was able to remain highly successful. However, following the retirement of Charles, his successors would not be as astute. A series of bad investments and poor management decisions would almost lead the bank to ruin, and the family would need to add in more of their own capital to stabilize and save the bank. Yet ultimately, it would make it through and stabilize. By this point, Hoare and Company had really established itself as a prestige bank, being the place to go for discreet and high-class service, and also earning itself many puns, because, yeah, I know. When you do business with whores, you want them to be discreet. They would continue in this manner into the 20th century, and in 1929, the bank would change its partnership structure to become a private unlimited liability company. These partnership structures are really significant in this type of banking, as particularly when you are managing the money of some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in all the world. They want to know that you have a stake in the game. They want to know that if you fail, you go down with the ship, and that your own name, legacy, and wealth are on the line. This is very different than modern publicly traded banks, where a board of directors appoints executives, all aligned in the interests of maximizing quarterly results, trying to make sure that fund managers buy their stock. With these sorts of structures, the interests of the partners and the managers is in long-term success, with the family's own wealth and legacy tied to the success of their clients. The company would continue to be run by members of the Hoare family until 2016, when the first non-family member, David Green, would become CEO. This, however, wouldn't mean that the family were out of the bank. The family still retains ownership and full control through the partnership. This is still very much their bank, even if they have somebody else as executive. Today, Hoare & Company is owned and run by the 12th generation of the family, with 6 family members listed as partners and directors of the firm. Currently, the chairman of the bank is Nick Macpherson, the Baron Macpherson of Earl's Court, who had been permanent secretary to the Treasury from 2005 to 2016. These banks play a really unique role. They exist as prestige private banks, offering traditional private banking services, as well as all sorts of personal services. which could range from concierge service to flights and travel. To become a client of Hoare & Company, you need to be introduced by 2 current clients and have £3 million to put with them, although some other sources range from 2 to 10. An additional service that these banks offer is that they allow very wealthy people to get their money to places that would normally be quite difficult. This could be more exclusive investments, or into the broader offshore banking network. These banks are some of the best entry points for the wealthy to be able to move their money where they want, and to have more particular needs met, all with an extremely high level of service and extreme discretion. Within the United Kingdom, there are really 2 such banks that exist on this level of prestige private bank: Hoare & Company and Coutts, both very old private banks, both of whom have had some of Britain's wealthiest and most powerful figures as clients, including other powerful businessmen and financiers, as well as noblemen and monarchs. With 12 generations of family ownership, this makes the Hoares the oldest family of prestige bankers in the United Kingdom, and historically quite interesting, with direct lineage tracing all the way back to goldsmith banking. The stories of these families are incredible, but more than being stories of success, they give us an insight into where our system comes from. For this class is the group at the top of our modern order. They are the people who built it, who sculpted it into their image. For these are the people who are behind the great empires of the prior centuries, and behind the financialized modern global liberal order. By knowing their stories, we gain an insight into understanding why the world is as it is, why we exist in a world of perpetual debt, central banks, and taxes. And while the stories of these families which I have highlighted are incredibly impressive, although also with a darker side, these are far from the only people like this, so I thought I would include some honorable mentions. The Metzler family. This is the family behind Metzler Bank, Germany's second oldest bank behind only Berenbergs, established in 1647 by Benjamin Metzler, originally started as a trading company. Over its long history, it has transformed itself into being a private banking, asset management, and wealth management firm, much more in the model of the Swiss banks, which manage wealth for wealthy clients. You won't see very large revenue numbers or assets under management appear on their statements, yet they are highly integrated into the upper class of Europe. As a note, there are many banks and institutions that on paper don't appear to be large firms, yet their services for the world's elite are very important and are not always visible. And with a very long history of serving Europe's wealth, the Metzlers are certainly a prime and very old wealthy banking family. The Lombard and Odier families. These families could have very easily been in the place of Pictets in this video. They fulfill a similar function, and have at time to time formed partnerships with the Pictet family, operating as very old and very subtle Swiss private bankers. The Lazard and David Weil families. This one was a bit of a tough call, as Lazard is a very powerful international firm. You may have noticed that there are no American families on this list, and in part that is because this class really wasn't able to emerge in the United States in the way it was in Europe, as these European banking families were able to get such status and power because of the empires, and also because the networks that they are a part of stretch much further back in history, far before the United States. Yet Lazard and their cousins, the David Wiles, are a curiosity. They're a little bit European and a little bit American. The Lazard brothers were French Jews who moved to New Orleans and later participated in the California gold rush, setting up a highly successful dry goods business, with Lazard brother Simon Lazard taking the money he was making and getting into banking. This would expand into an international operation, one which financed the gold rush, but also became a very large player in the international gold market. The bank formed would be Lazard Frères, and after the death of Simon and the original brothers, leadership would pass to their cousin, Alexandre Weil, who would join the brothers in 1856. The original venture set up by Simon and his brothers would break up into the houses of Lazard, one in New York, one in London, and one in France. Simon himself would return to France in 1861, living there until his death in 1898, and the separate houses of Lazard would remain generally, though not always completely controlled, by the descendants of Weil. The David Wiles would remain with Lazard until its 2005 IPO, which would be overseen by Chairman Michael David Weil. The firm now exists today as Lazard, after being reunified in 2000. Between the descendants of the Lazards and the David Wiles, this extended family has had tremendous influence in finance, and not just through the international powerhouse of Lazard. However, they don't quite fit into this mold of old banking families of Europe, though they would most likely be the closest that anyone in America has come. The Barclay family share common elements in their history with the Rothschild, Barings, and Hoare families, and they were a strong contender for this list, but didn't have quite the same staying power as the others. Today, the bank Barclays remains a global powerhouse. It can trace its origins to 1690, when Goldsmith bankers Thomas Gould and John Frame would open a bank together in London, and in 1736, they would take on John's son-in-law, James Barclay, as a partner. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, their bank would be a true powerhouse, one of the most powerful in Britain and all the world. In 1896, it would merge with 19 other private banks, creating a new joint stock company, Barclay and Company. Members of the family would continue in leadership roles for some time, as well as frequently being board members. The Barclay family continue in finance today, and many of them have retained their wealth, yet they do not remain in control of the bank, and currently their financial ventures tend to be their own investment projects. They certainly still remain in this class, and have a very old and impressive banking history, yet have been a little bit more destabilized than the others. Certainly though, their history and their success does put them as very honorable mentions who certainly could have been featured in this video. The Grosvenor family. This is a curious one that I couldn't quite fit into this class, but I did consider adding them to the video, as their history runs parallel to this banking class. They are part of England's traditional nobility, tracing their title to Sir Richard Grosvenor, 1st Baronet, born in 1585. He was knighted by James I and was High Sheriff of Cheshire, as well as its Member of Parliament. His title was created for him in 1622. However, their family history traces much further back than that. They can trace their family origin back to Gilbert de Grosvenor, who had come to England with William the Conqueror, and they were granted lands during the Norman conquest. Thus, even if their title wasn't created until the 16th century, their origin goes back to traditional medieval warrior aristocracy, and not the financial ruling class. Over many subsequent generations, they would achieve many more lands and titles, with Hugh Grosvenor, born in 1825, becoming the first Duke of Westminster. Particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, the family would thoroughly develop their estates, building vast housing, as well as developing Belgravia and Pimlico. Something that makes them very interesting is that at this time, while the traditional nobility were getting forced out by the rising banking aristocracy, the Grosvenors were able to hold on, and they achieved this by being really shrewd investors in real estate. Today, the head of the family is Hugh Grosvenor, the 7th Duke, and for generations they have invested through the Grosvenor Group, which is a global real estate firm, and distinct from Grosvenor Capital Management. The Grosvenor Group is really interesting because it might be the most successful example of the traditional nobility being able to diversify. For a start, the title of Duke is remarkable, and for those who aren't familiar with the different titles within British peerage, Duke is as good as it gets. That's top lord. And when so many of their peers were being bankrupt and forced out, their shrewd investment allowed them to remain very wealthy and successful. And though this is quite different from banking finance, real estate is adjacent. So while I can't count them in the same category as the banking families, they're certainly worthy of note. The Van Lanschot family. This family can trace its origins to the 15th century, where its members were involved in activities like brick and winemaking. Part of the thriving Dutch class of craftsmen, in 1737, Cornelius van Lanschot would form a trading company, capitalizing on the thriving colonial trade of the time. This would form the basis of what is today Van Lanschot Kempen, a quite prominent Dutch bank involved in private wealth and asset management, much in the vein of the private banks that we've discussed before, but one that also was involved in investment banking. In 1799, Franciscus van Lanschot would take over, and at this point it would begin true banking activities. For many generations to follow, their bank would be enormously successful, earning the family tremendous wealth, and it would operate largely unchanged for centuries, and would remain entirely in the family's control. Until 1973, the powerful British bank, NatWest, would acquire a minority position, making it the first non-family shareholder. And in 1990, NatWest would increase its stake, acquiring an 80% position in the bank. The following year, Jan Cees van Lanschot would die, and with his departure, this would be the first time the executive board of the bank did not have a family member on it. And in 2018, Gottfried van Lanschot would leave the supervisory board, making this the first time in its multi-century history that the family was not involved in the running of the bank. The family have had enormous success outside of banking as well, particularly in politics. Today, Van Lanschot descendant Reinier van Lanschot is a member of the European Parliament. He founded the party Volt Nederland, part of the larger pan-Europeanist Volt Party. Their positions are pan-Europeanism, progressivism, and social liberalism, pretty much exactly the liberal globalism you'd expect from a multi-generational banking oligarch. The Fugger family may have achieved more raw economic dominance than anyone else on this list, and while they certainly remain a very wealthy and influential family to today, their true heights in financial power were further back in history. Founded by Hans Fugger in Graben, the Holy Roman Empire during the Renaissance, the Fuggers were a family of wealthy merchants, particularly in textiles, yet the family would really come to prominence with Jacob Fugger, born in 1459. The family had been making loans for some time, and were a very wealthy family across the Holy Roman Empire. Yet Jacob would begin financing mines, quickly becoming one of the most powerful players in Europe's metals market. Yet something that really allowed the family to become powerful was Jacob's recognition of the Habsburgs and his belief that they would become a dominant power in Europe. He would begin making loans to Sigismund, the Archduke of Austria, and later become banker to Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. As a result of these dealings, he established a mining monopoly and became top banker to the family that held Spain, Bohemia, Hungary, and sat as Holy Roman Emperor. Another significant client would be the Vatican, with Jacob Fugger being the financier of St. Peter's Basilica. The raw dominance that this family had in metals, particularly the copper market, was so staggering that at one point their wealth is estimated to be around 2% of Europe's GDP at the time. Take Europe's GDP today of around $28.22 trillion. 2% of that would place them at $564.4 billion. Yet today, Europe isn't as economically dominant as it once was, so this may not be the best comparison for their economic power, particularly throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, as Europe was becoming the wealthiest and most productive place on Earth. We should think of it as somewhere that accounts for a larger share of wealth today. So when trying to consider true economic power, it's really difficult to make an estimate, but it's very likely equivalent to somebody having trillions today. The family's businesses would be badly damaged by the 30 Years' War, and in 1658, they would dissolve their family's firm. Yet the family would remain quite prominent in German politics, business, and finance, particularly by managing their vast estates. And their prominence can be clearly noted, as they would be elevated to counts and princes in the Holy Roman Empire, going forward even into the 19th century, when the Babenhausen branch would be elevated to Holy Roman Imperial Princes. Today there are three main lines of the family: the Fugger-Babenhausens, a princely family, the Fugger von Glotz, a princely family, and the Fugger-Kirchbergs, a noble family of Grafs. Today they mostly focus on foundations and their estate, holding the world's oldest social housing complex. Their foundation is overseen by Alexander Fugger-Babenhausen, and they remain very wealthy and very prominent. The Castell family are one of the best examples of a family that was successfully able to transition as an old traditional nobility family into becoming a modern banking aristocracy family. Throughout the early modern period, the rising financial upper class destroyed so much of Europe's traditional nobility, as they were their primary competition and stood in the way of the power that they were accumulating. Yet there are some examples of traditional noblemen who adopted banking and became part of the modern ruling class. The Castell are one such example. They can trace their history back as medieval nobility, with the County of Castell in modern Bavaria being created in 1200 for Count Rupert I, and they operated as traditional German nobility for many centuries. Their shift to becoming a banking family begins in 1774, when the family would form a small lending bank with the intention of financing artisans, farmers, and merchants, attempting to secure the economic independence of their county. Yet the bank would grow over the following centuries, becoming a substantial corporate banking and asset management firm in the 19th century. However, the family as a whole would be involved in many different business ventures, not only maintaining their wealth, which was becoming increasingly rare for traditional nobility, but growing it. In 1941, two Castell banks would merge, Landeskreditkasse and New Kreditkasse. This would form Fürstlich Castelsche Bank, which today is still a family-owned bank focusing on wealth management, asset management, and private banking, much in the vein of banking families providing banking and wealth management services for other banking families, as well as other members of Europe's ruling class. Today the two main lines of the house remain, the Castell line and the Castell-Rudenhausen line. They are extremely successful private bankers and wealth managers, and with a very long history and claim to traditional nobility, they successfully operate with prestige and discretion, being among the best and longest integrated into Germany's ruling class. And last, the final honorable mentions for this list are the Rahn and Bodmer families. Rahn Bodmer & Co. is Zurich's oldest private bank, and it is another one of those unlimited liability private banking institutions, like we've seen with Lombard Odier and Pictets. Yet the true banking prowess of these families is newer, although the firm itself has a quite old history. In 1750, merchants Caspar and Hans Conrad Schultes opened a silk trading house in Zurich, and through successive generations they began to engage in finance. By 1855, they had fully transitioned into becoming a bank. In 1882, Louis Rahnballacher would join as a partner, with his name added not long after, and in 1917, Dr. Max Ernst Bodmer would join, with the name changed to what it is today. Bodmers would be active in the firm until 2024, when Andre Bodmer would leave the firm, ending the family's active management. Yet the Rahn family continues today, with Peter and Christian remaining as unlimited liability partners. And prior to joining the bank, the families of the partners were quite wealthy in Switzerland. But because their true presence in Swiss private banking and as members of this class is newer, they don't quite fit into the same spot as the Pictet family or the Lombard and Odier. Yet they still are deserving of an honorable mention. This is a very interesting class, and one that very often people are aware of but don't quite know much about. And that's in large part because unlike modern celebrity CEOs who have to go out in public and market themselves, these very old established banking families have been the ruling class for centuries. They were the most dominant class behind the European empires, and the ones who constructed the modern order. There's no need at all for them to be out on TV marketing themselves. In fact, what's in their best interest is to stay quiet. They don't want attention. And because of the sheer influence this class has had, and that in the modern financialized world, they function as the nobility, they're a class that's really worthy of study. And though this list is far from exhaustive, it does shed light on just how powerful these families are and where they came from.